Hello and welcome to Gay Cruise and Travel Podcast with me, Just Joey T. All right, if you're watching the video version of this podcast, which is available on my YouTube channel, Just Joey T, I'm in my gym attire today. We're going to the gym after recording this. If my battery on my camera doesn't run out before this recording, but it's Saturday as I record this, but it's Monday when you're listening to this. Again, if you're listening to this on your commute and you are driving, stop. No, don't stop driving. Stop listening to the podcast. But seriously, we're going to keep it a little bit lighter today. I know on a lot of episodes of the podcast, I like to throw a lot of information at y'all because a lot of times I get comments and questions that ask about, oh, could you talk about this cruise that's coming up? I want to know the details. I want to know the dates, the itinerary, what the vibe is like, what that sailing is going to be like. And obviously when Atlantis, for example, they have an announcement on a new cruise or something's about to go on sale or something's going to sell out. I always want to get all my listeners, all of you guys, the latest information on those types of news. Today, we're going to kind of chill it down a little bit. So there's not going to be a lot of like hard-hitting data for you. But I have had a few people randomly here and there where they just want a little bit of an overview, a high-level overview of all the cruises Atlantis sails in a typical year. No, not every year the cruises are going to be, the cruise calendars can look the same. There's some year where you get an Asia cruise. Some years you might get a cruise down in Australia or New Zealand. But most years, by and large, Atlantis has a fairly similar set of cruises. They sail every single year. And for those of you who are interested in your first Atlantis cruise, or you might have sailed with Atlantis before, you might have been on one or two cruises with them, and you're thinking, what other cruises does Atlantis sail? I've tried this particular cruise with Atlantis, but maybe I want to try a different cruise, maybe different itineraries in a different part of the world, maybe at a different time of the year. So what I'm going to do today is give a high-level overview of the sailings that Atlantis does in most typical years. Because again, keep this in mind, not every year's cruise schedule is going to be the same, but I'll point out the ones that happen pretty much every single year without fail, upon the ones that happen every so often. They're not every year, but they happen, maybe like every other year or like every few years. And I also point out just a couple of the ones that seem like they might be one-offs. It's whenever Atlantis might happen upon a ship, there's some sort of availability for them to do something extra. Maybe it's a one-time thing. And they've done it, and they've done those sailings as well. So with all that said, here we go. Let's start from the winter time into the spring or the beginning of the year. We've talked a lot on this podcast about the big party cruise, quote unquote, the big one, that these days is usually in February. So we had one on the Allure of the Seas from Royal Caribbean this year in 2025 in February. The next one of this cruise is February 2026 on the Symphony of the Seas, which is a sister ship to the Allure, also from Royal Caribbean. So over the last several years, COVID notwithstanding, they pretty much always sailed this cruise. End of January or early February has always been on this particular class of ships from Royal Caribbean. It is the Oasis class of the ship. So Allure, Harmony, Symphony, the Oasis, all part of that family. And so it is this year, again next year. And that's one of the two Caribbean cruises Atlantis usually has. Just a couple episodes ago, I talked about the other Caribbean cruise Atlantis just announced for 2026. So they also do this other Caribbean cruise. So you have the big party cruise. All the party boys go on that. It's a huge cruise. And everyone who doesn't want a party cruise but wants a cruise at that time of the year, in January or February or maybe even March, they will go to this other one. So if you want more details specifically on what this second Caribbean cruise is going to be like, specifically for 2026, it was the last episode I'm seeing on my list here, episode 27 on June 9th that I talked a little bit more about for 2026 what this second Caribbean cruise is going to be like. But yeah, very generally, at the beginning of the year, Atlantis would do 2 cruises. The vibe for both of them are pretty similar most years. Get the big cruise, that's the party cruise, much more lively, much more energetic. The parties are much bigger, more well attended. They almost always have an EDM concert on that one now, on one of the biggest cruise ships in the world. That is, I just call it the party cruise basically. And then the other cruise is going to be a little bit smaller, usually like a mid-sized ship, a ship that can hold up to like 2,500 to 3,000 people. That's what I consider like a mid-sized ship for like an ocean cruise ship. And this year is on a Virgin ship, as are a lot of Atlantis cruises nowadays. And that one doesn't usually sell out. The itinerary is going to be a little bit different. A lot of the times they'll do maybe more of a Southern Caribbean itinerary. And the vibe is more relaxing, more easygoing, less crowded, less crazy partying. They still host pretty much most of the same parties as they would on other cruises. But the scale of them, on the big party cruise, you go to a tea dance, there's like, it's packed. It's packed. It's like hundreds and like several hundreds of people are there. When you go to the tea dance on the second Caribbean cruise, you're not going to get like 600-700 people there. It's just not that type of a cruise. It's not like a party cruise. It's not, as jam-packed. It's just a more relaxing type of cruise. And there's nothing wrong with that. So those are the 2 cruises Atlantis will usually have during the wintertime into the spring. The second Caribbean cruise, usually it's maybe like 1 or 2 weeks before or after the party cruise. It's not really designed that people would go on both. Someone that goes on one of these cruises, they're not going to 2 or 3 weeks later go on the other cruise. So there's actually very little overlap between the 2 cruises, and they can kind of sort of schedule them close together and not have that be like a bad thing. But one year I did attend both of them though. It was an off year for me. Now, those 2 almost always happen every single year. Sometimes we'll also get an additional cruise around May, like springtime, just before summer. So this year, for example, we had the Memorial Day weekend cruise out of Miami on the Virgin ship. And way back in 2016, another cruise I was on in May was on the Anthem of the Seas with Royal Caribbean from New York. So that was actually a really, really fun one. So every once in a great while, Atlantis will sometimes sneak in an additional cruise between the 2 Caribbean ones early on in the year, January, February, and then before the ones that they usually have in Europe in the summer, which we will talk about now. So in the summertime, July, August, usually Atlantis almost always have 2 Mediterranean cruises. So in 2024, for example, they had 2 back-to-back cruises in August. This year, they have one in July and then one in August. So it just depends on the year, but like they always have one in August, it seems like. And then the other one, it'll be either August or July, I guess depends on the availability of the various ships they're able to charter. Yeah, but that's pretty much a staple. You can always count on a couple of Mediterranean cruises with Atlantis in July and August. Sometimes they will sneak in a third if they're able to do it. So 2024, for example, they had 2 Virgin Med cruises back-to-back actually in August. And then they also had a third cruise in July, which was more like a luxury premium cruise, which was on a more premium cruise line with Oceania Cruise Lines. So that was an example recently where there were 3 cruises in Europe over the summer. Usually, the cruises that they do sail there, it's actually a really nice vibe. It's a really nice mix of, you get obviously a good amount of Europeans from all over attend that one. You also get a good amount of like people traveling in from overseas, especially from the Americas on it. So it's like a really diverse crowd. And it's really the ports, the places that the ship will visit and stop at. That's the main attraction of going to Europe, obviously. With the Caribbean cruises I talked about, that's in the wintertime. You don't necessarily go on those cruises for the ports. I mean, the ports are not the main attraction to be honest, most years. But when you go to the med cruises in the summer, it'll go to places it'll go to like Barcelona, it might go to Ibiza, it might go to Rome, it might go to Casablanca, like a lot of places where people would want to get off the ship and actually explore what those cities and places and towns are like. But even then, the vibe on the ship I find it really nice. It's a really nice balance between great ports where like you want to get off the ship, but there's lots of things to see if you want to do that. There's a really diverse crowd on board the ship. And the parties are like well attended, but not crazy. I gave the example before, the 2 Caribbean cruises beginning of the year. You get the party cruise, and the parties are massive and they're jam packed. And then the other Caribbean cruise, a few weeks apart, the parties are there, but you're not gonna get like, not even like a few hundred people go there. You're not gonna even have like 300, 400, 500 people. It's not a party cruise. So like the onboard vibe is actually quite a big contrast between the two. And I feel like with the med cruises, it's kind of a bit of Goldilocks in between those two extremes with those 2 Caribbean cruises, because the parties are well attended, but they're not like super hardcore. They're not jam packed. You get a nice amount of people at the parties that are partying, and you get a really diverse range of people. And I think it's great for first timers. If you happen to be in Europe or you want to go to Europe in the summer, like I wouldn't go just to Europe just to do the cruise if you don't have any interest in getting off the ship or sightseeing in Europe or being in Europe otherwise, or if you don't live in Europe or you wouldn't already be there for some other reason. So that's Europe for you, and that is what the summertime is like on the Atlantis schedule. Now we get into the fall, and every October there is always a Halloween cruise in the US. Almost every year in history, it's been out of the West Coast. It's been like the only cruise out of the West Coast, out of Southern California down to Mexico. It's been super reliable, one of the most reliably fun cruises on the Atlantis calendar. And I've been multiple sailings of that particular one. This year, they were not able to get a ship out of the West Coast, so they are sailing out of Miami. But it's still that same time frame, over Halloween, almost always, or very close to Halloween. So like it's always like the end of October. And so it is this year as well. And another mid-sized ship, this year's on a Virgin ship. On previous years, before we had Virgin ships, it's been on ships that had a capacity of very roughly like 3,000 passengers, like give or take. Some years it's been like a slightly smaller ship in the high 2,000s. Some years they got a slightly bigger ship in like the low 3,000s in terms of max capacity count. But I've always liked it, at least when it was on the West Coast, because again, it's also like that really nice mix between the party, like the parties are well attended and those are good parties, but it's not like a crazy party cruise that everyone is like going hardcore. It's that really nice mix of like, if you are a party person, you'll be happy. If you're not a party person, there's like all these other things to do and you'll also be happy as well. So that's, it's actually I'm holding judgment for this year's October Halloween cruise because it is out of the East Coast and I just don't quite know how that's going to affect the attendance and the vibe as well. But all the previous years when it was from Southern California off the West Coast, that was actually my number one recommendation when people ask, oh, I'm a first timer, which cruise should I go on? And if they happen to be living in the Americas, if they were living in the US, living in Canada, or living in Mexico, it wasn't going to be far for you to get to the West Coast, get to California. That was my number one recommendation for like, this is the one cruise I recommend. If this is your first time going on Atlantis, going on a gay cruise, and you want to know, want a good introduction and want a good taste of what the cruise experience is going to be like. Because yeah, it's like just a little bit of something for everyone. It's not a super massive ship where it could be like a little bit intimidating. The parties don't go too hard, but like it's still like a good party with good attendance, and you get like really good shows, still really good entertainers. The ship is it doesn't sell every year, but it's always like nicely full. It's always like 80 something, 90 something percent filled up. So, sometimes when you have a bigger ship and it's like sold out, sometimes you kind of feel it on the ship. Like it takes a little bit longer to wait for the elevators. The lines for the shows, if it's like a popular show, it's longer. It's a little longer to get to like the main dining during like the regular dinner time. So when a ship is like sometimes mostly, but not quite completely full, 80 something, 90% full, sometimes that is a little bit nicer. I just went on the Thanksgiving cruise, for example. It was, I don't know the exact numbers, but it was not full. One thing I didn't notice until near the end of that cruise was I never really had to wait for anything. It didn't feel like every corner of the ship was jam-packed. So sometimes people think, oh, the cruise is not going to sell out, or the cruise is not at capacity. Oh, like, does that mean that no one is going on it? It's like not going to be a fun cruise to go on. And like that's sometimes you don't want the ship to be completely full. So the Halloween cruise, it doesn't sell out every year. It just depends how big the ship is. Usually you get something like, when it was on the West Coast, like 2,500 to like 2,800 passengers that go on it. And previous years, like it doesn't matter. It was how big the ship was. That's just the number of boys that would usually sign up every year. But that's a good amount of boys to have, a good amount of people to have on the cruise, because it's a manageable size. You still get lots and lots of people to like meet and interact and party and socialize with, but it's not overwhelming. So that's the October cruise. Curious to see what's going to be like this year. They're doing it on the East Coast for the first time. Sometimes they will also have an additional cruise in November, and usually that would be if they are able to get a cruise ship in Asia. So they did this in 2023, and they're doing it again this year. So this November, in 2025, they're going to have a Hong Kong to Singapore cruise. And they also had another Asia cruise in 2023 as well. So I've not been on the Asia cruise personally, but from what I've heard from talking to lots of people, it's obviously, if you want to go see Asia, it's kind of sort of like the Mediterranean cruises in Europe. Part of the draw of doing these non-US cruises is like the destinations, the ports of call, the places that the ship is visiting. If you just want to be on the ship the whole time and you're not already in Asia, I'm not sure it makes sense. That's the same note I gave for, I wouldn't fly from the US all the way to Europe for one of the Mediterranean cruises in the summer if you have no interest in being in Europe or seeing any places in Europe, or if you have no interest in any of the places that the ship's going to visit on this itinerary. So similar notes for potential Asia cruises, which tends to happen in November. It doesn't happen every year, but in recent years, they have visited Asia in November every so often, including this year. So one of these days, I will go on one of those Asia cruises and really get my first-hand feel for what it's like. But from what I've heard, it's a slightly more relaxed cruise. It's not a big party cruise. Still have some partying, but not like a lot of heavy partying. And it tends to be a longer cruise. I think the one that's coming up this November, I think it's like 9 or 10 days, whereas maybe your average Atlantis cruise is 7 days. It's a week. And yeah, it's more about getting off the ship, going to all these places that are like just beautiful places that you want to get off the ship and explore a little bit. Again, you'll get some people that that live in Asia that will get on the cruise, and you get that extra bit of diversity is sometimes really nice, especially at least for me anyway, someone who is like spends most of the time in the US doing the US cruises. All right. So that is basically all the cruises that Atlantis sails all the time, pretty much every year. And also some cruises where Atlantis will sail like every so often. Maybe not every year, but like every so often, every like 2 or 3 years. Recently, we've seen those cruises pop their heads into the schedule. There are sometimes one-off cruises, and those are things where Atlantis does get feedback from customers and guests about, hey, why don't you try cruising this time of the year? Hey, why don't you try this different type of cruise on your cruise ship? Hey, why don't you sail to these destinations or this part of the world? And I know Atlantis does hear all that feedback, but logistically, it's quite difficult and complicated to, like, number one, get a ship, because Atlantis is actually at the mercy of all the cruise lines. And the cruise lines obviously all run their own sailings on their own cruise ships. Once in a while, they'll be able to charter out the ship for like a week or week and a half or whatever to a charter company like Atlantis for them to do something. So some of the factors that makes it more difficult is, where are their ships? So let's say Atlantis gets a lot of demand to do another cruise in Australia. Okay, so first of all, they need to see, okay, which ships will actually be in that region. At what time of the year would those ships be there? Is that ship suitable for an Atlantis type cruise? Because an Atlantis cruise is not like a regular cruise. They put on all this extra entertainment, and there needs to be like good venues for that. There are ships where I've been on, like many years ago, where the venues were just not good for any of the parties that Atlantis throws. Like just the layout of the ship. Doesn't mean the ship was bad. It just wasn't good for Atlantis. If you just did a regular sailing on it, it was fine. But just the fact that Atlantis does the extra entertainment, have those extra events, means not all ships are suitable. Probably not every cruise line wants to work with every charter company. There are definitely cruise lines that are a little bit more queer friendly, like Virgin is one of them, for example. I can see some cruise lines not being a huge fan of that. Some cruise lines don't like chartering their ships out. That's why there are quite a few cruise lines out there. But with Atlantis, it's rare to see cruise lines outside of Royal Caribbean, Virgin, and Norwegian. And in like the last few years, it's mostly like Royal Caribbean and Virgin. In some previous years, we've had some other cruise lines, but there are actually much more cruise lines out there. Not everybody wants to do a charter, so that's just like scratching the surface. There's like a lot of like logistical considerations that has to go into see, if people want a Australia cruise, it's like, okay, they need to find a ship and they need to match up the schedule of the cruise lines and do all this and do all that. So the Australia one I picked up, so they did do a Melbourne to Sydney sailing in February of 2024. They have done sailings down in like Australia, in New Zealand before that, for example. But it's like every once in a while they'll be able to find a cruise and able to make it happen. It's kind of sort of a one-off at this point, but very occasionally they do that. And I talked about the Asia cruises in November. So in the last few years, they've been able to do one in November. But in 2019, for example, they did a Hong Kong to Tokyo in April. So that's another example where it was kind of like a one-off, an Asia cruise in April. Usually, historically, it's a little bit harder to get a charter ship in that region, kind of that part of the year. Yeah, but that's just another example of sometimes you do get the one-offs, and every year is a little bit different. This year, for example, coming up over New Year's, we have the Tahiti cruise, and Atlantis doesn't usually do anything over the New Year's, like December into January. But this year, they're on the Oceania, again, it's a more premium luxury cruise line. They're doing a Tahiti cruise over New Year's. It's sort of like hotcakes, but that's not something that they usually do. So what I will say, though, is please subscribe to the podcast. And as new Atlantis cruises are revealed and announced and go on sale, and as they fill up, and as some of them at least sell out, I will keep all of you updated on all the different sailings Atlantis has. Doesn't matter if it's this year or next year. As soon as I know about them, you will know about them too. And if there are any questions you have about particular Atlantis sailings, if you're still confused about I know you have all these cruises that you talked about that Atlantis has, Joey, but I don't know what kind of cruise would be good for me, or just comment down in the YouTube comments below on any of my YouTube videos. I do see the comments. I am getting better at replying to them. Sometimes I like to reply to the comments. Like this video is because I got a few comments that kind of asked about, hey, what are the different cruises that Atlantis has throughout the year? And this is, that's how this particular podcast, this episode was born. So sometimes I might not answer you in the comments, but I might do a whole episode of the podcast to answer your questions. So that's why you should stay subscribed to the podcast, keep listening. for new episodes, because you might never know when I will read your question and then answer it on the air. All right, until next time, the next episode of the Gay Cruise and Travel Podcast with me, Just Joey T. Stay safe, and I will see you later. Bye, y'all.